One crisp morning at the bustling Skylux Airlines terminal, the air buzzed with the hum of rolling suitcases and hurried footsteps, coffee cups clinking in hand. Margaret Harper, a 42-year-old black CEO, settled in her first-class seat, number 2A, with a sense of purpose. She had chosen this seat specifically for its generous legroom, planning to review her keynote speech for the Global Ethics and Technology Conference later that week. The airport was a maze of polished floors and impatient travelers, but the first-class cabin of Skylux Airlines was a sanctuary of luxury polished wood panels, heated towels waiting on silver trays, champagne service offered before takeoff, and seats that reclined into full beds. For Margaret, founder and CEO of Right Tech Solutions, a $2.8 billion AI company specializing in eliminating bias in customer service, this was just another day of travel. But it was also a moment that would test everything she believed in. Margaret wasn't just a businesswoman. She was a product of grit and grace. Growing up in South Chicago, she learned to code at 11 years old on a second-hand computer while other kids played video games in the streets. Her neighborhood was tough, marked by the occasional siren and the weight of community struggles, but shaped her. By 16, after her father was killed in a senseless attack that shook their block, she stood at his grave under a gray, heavy sky, vowing to make people see each other as human beings first. That vow drove 2 decades of relentless work coding 18 hours a day in a cramped apartment, juggling night shifts at diners to pay rent, building Right Tech Solutions from a dream into a powerhouse. Now, at 42, she carried that promise like a shield, her success a quiet rebellion against the world that had tried to dim her light. Earlier that morning, security cameras had captured her kindness helping an elderly woman struggling with a heavy suitcase, patiently guiding her to the right gate, holding doors open for strangers with a warm smile, and tipping generously at the airport cafe. Not because she was being watched, but because that's who Margaret Richardson was. Humble despite her $2.8 billion empire, kind despite the power she wielded, she believed in decency above all. As she settled into seat 2A, her tablet glowed with slides for her keynote on ethics and technology, her mind sharp and focused. She didn't know it yet, but that focus was about to be shattered. A shadow fell over her screen, and the piece vanished. Flight attendant Jessica Miller approached, her uniform crisp, but her tone dripping with condescension despite the polite words. "There seems to be a mistake, ma'am. We need you to move to accommodate our VIP passenger, Karen," Jessica said, her smile tight and forced, like a mask about to crack. "This seat is reserved for only our Platinum members. You don't belong and can't sit here." Behind her stood Karen Wickfield, an elegantly dressed white woman in her 50s, tapping her designer watch impatiently, her eyes darting between Margaret and the seat she clearly considered hers. "I always sit there. It's practically my seat," Karen muttered, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, her voice carrying a mix of entitlement and irritation that made the air feel heavier. Margaret looked up, confusion crossing her face like a cloud over a clear sky. She had done everything right, booked her ticket weeks early, paid in full, arrived on time, her Platinum card still warm from her wallet. "I'm a Platinum member," she replied evenly, holding up the card, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "And this is my assigned seat." Jessica's smile tightened, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before it was replaced by determination. "I understand, ma'am, but this particular seat is typically reserved for a better customer," she said, pointing to Karen with a subtle nod. "Our regular Platinum member who flies with us frequently." The implication was clear. Regardless of Margaret's status, her presence in that seat was a problem to be solved, an inconvenience to be swept away. Passengers began to notice. Phones slowly emerged from pockets and purses, screens glowing in the dim cabin light. Whispers started, a low buzz of curiosity and judgment that filled the space like static. "She doesn't look like she belongs here," an older man in a tweed jacket muttered to his wife 2 rows back, his voice loud enough for Margaret to hear, slicing through her calm like a knife. What the flight crew didn't know, what none of them could have anticipated, was that this simple act of discrimination would ignite a fire that would consume their world in the next few hours, not just for them, but for the entire airline. Because the woman they underestimated, the one they told didn't belong, held their fate in her hands. Tom Sullivan, Margaret's childhood friend and now a retired lawyer, was waiting at the gate, his sharp eyes catching the tension through the glass walls. He had returned to help Margaret with legal prep for her conference, but his worried expression hinted at deeper secrets about Skylux he hadn't shared, ghosts of contracts and policies he'd once overlooked. As he watched Jessica retreat and Karen's impatience grow, his stomach twisted. He knew the airline's culture was flawed, but he hadn't expected this raw, blatant disregard for fairness. The event that set everything in motion was Jessica's refusal to back down. She nodded curtly at Margaret and walked away, but the seed was planted. Karen's theatrics escalated, her sighs echoing through the cabin as she checked her watch dramatically. "This is beyond ridiculous," she announced, her voice rising above the hum of the air conditioning. "I have an important meeting right after landing. I need my usual seat." Margaret remained composed, but inside, her mind raced back to South Chicago playgrounds where kids sneered, classrooms where teachers doubted, boardrooms where she was the only black face. She wasn't about to let history repeat itself. "No, thank you," she said firmly when Jessica returned with a clipboard, her voice carrying the weight of every fight she'd ever won. "I've selected this seat specifically for the legroom. I need to work during the flight." And that was the hook that would pull you in, the question that lingered like a shadow. What would Margaret do next? Would she stand her ground against this tide of prejudice? Or would the pressure force her to give in, just like so many before her had? The first-class cabin of Skylux Airlines was no longer a haven of luxury. It had become a battlefield, the air thick with tension and judgment. Margaret Harper sat in seat 2, her platinum card still in hand, but the calm she projected in I was starting to fray under the weight of stares, whispers, and the growing hostility around her. Jessica Miller, the flight attendant, had retreated to the front of the cabin, but her occasional glances back at Margaret carried a mix of frustration and unease, like a cat watching prey it couldn't quite catch. Karen Wickfield, the white passenger who demanded the seat, stood in the aisle, her designer handbag clutched like a shield, her impatience now a performance for anyone watching. Each dramatic sigh and tap of her watch a signal to the world that she was the victim here. Margaret tried to focus on her tablet. The glow of her keynote slides a faint lifeline to normalcy, but the murmurs from nearby passengers made it impossible. She should just move and stop causing trouble. An older man in a tweed jacket muttered to his wife 2 rows back, his voice loud enough to slice through the hum of the cabin, drawing nods from a few others. "He doesn't even look like someone who can afford first class," a middle-aged woman whispered to her companion, her tone dripping with assumption, her eyes flicking toward Margaret with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Each word was a pinprick, but Margaret kept her face smooth, her jaw tight, a skill honed from years of navigating rooms where she was the only black face, the only voice that didn't quite fit. Tom Sullivan, her childhood friend and retired lawyer, had just boarded the plane, his sharp eyes scanning the scene like a hawk spotting trouble. He pushed through the crowd, his loafers silent on the carpet, and stopped beside Margaret, his voice low and urgent. "Maggie, what's going on here?" he asked, his worry etched into the lines around his eyes, his gray suit rumpled from the rush. Margaret explained quickly, her words clipped but clear, showing him her boarding pass and platinum card. Tom's face darkened, a shadow passing over his features, and he muttered, "This isn't right." But there was a hesitation in his voice, a flicker of guilt that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. Secrets about Skylux he'd buried deep, contracts he'd once signed without questioning. The first real challenge came when Trevor, the cabin supervisor, strode down the aisle with the confidence of a man used to getting his way. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid, but his expression was cold, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Ma'am, we need you to move to accommodate our VIP passenger," he announced, his voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. carrying the weight of authority, but laced with an edge that made it clear this wasn't a request, it was a command. Margaret met his gaze, her voice steady but firm, a quiet steel beneath the calm. "I've shown my boarding pass and platinum status. This is my assigned seat," she repeated, her words measured, each one a brick in the wall she was building against their pressure. Trevor's face twitched, a muscle near his jaw jumping like a live wire, and he leaned in slightly, his tone dripping with condescension that made several nearby passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Perhaps you're unfamiliar with how things work on this airline," he said, emphasizing each word as if speaking to a child, his voice slow and deliberate. "We accommodate worthy customers who have specific preferences." The word worthy hung in the air like a slap, a reminder of every time Margaret had been told she didn't measure up, and her stomach tightened, but she didn't flinch. This was the moment the conflict turned ugly, a spark igniting the dry tinder of prejudice. Karen, emboldened by Trevor's support, stepped forward, her heels clicking on the aisle floor, her voice rising dramatically as if she were on stage. "I always sit here on this route. It's practically my seat," she declared, her words loud enough to draw more eyes, her designer handbag now a prop in her performance of entitlement. Passengers shifted, some pulling out phones to record openly, others exchanging looks of disbelief or sympathy. A businesswoman across the aisle, her laptop balanced on her knees, angled her phone discreetly, capturing Trevor's sneer, Jessica's discomfort, and Karen's smug satisfaction as she stood there, arms crossed, waiting for Margaret to crumble. The stakes escalated fast, like a pot boiling over. Jessica returned, her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and fear, and whispered something to Trevor, her eyes darting toward the cockpit. Moments later, as Karen pretended to adjust her carry-on in the overhead bin, she slipped a folded stack of notes into Jessica's pocket with practiced discretion, her movements smooth but not invisible. "I appreciate your help with this situation," Karen whispered, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, her voice carrying a chilling casualness. The bribe was subtle but unmistakable, a transaction that transformed a seating dispute into something far more sinister, a betrayal of everything Skylux claimed to stand for. Tom watched, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, his knuckles white against the gray of his suit. He knew Skylux's internal policies were shaky, their customer service rankings slipping, their booking systems outdated, but he hadn't expected this open discrimination, cash changing hands in plain sight. "Maggie, let me handle this," he said, stepping closer, his voice low but urgent, but Margaret shook her head, her eyes locked on Trevor. "No, Tom, I'm not moving," she said firmly, her words a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. Her 6 simple words, delivered without anger but with absolute certainty, silenced the cabin for a heartbeat, the weight of them hanging like a challenge. Sheriff Daniel Reed, the airport security chief, had arrived at the gate, alerted by a passenger's call. He stood outside the glass walls, his uniform crisp but his expression troubled, his radio crackling softly as he observed. "This isn't right," he muttered to his deputy, a younger man in a matching uniform, his brow furrowed. "Let's see how far they push it." Inside, the tension was palpable, the air thick with the scent of coffee from the galley and the faint tang of fear. And then came a micro-hook that would keep you on the edge of your seat, your heart pounding. Who was pulling the strings behind this chaos? And what would happen if Margaret refused to back down? The drama was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than anyone in that cabin could imagine. Hey folks, have you ever been treated unfairly just because of how you look? Drop your experiences in the comments below, and if you stand against prejudice and injustice, hit that subscribe button right now and type justice and where you're watching from in the comment section. Let's keep this conversation going. The first-class cabin of Skylux Airlines was a pressure cooker, the tension so thick you could almost taste it coffee from the galley, the faint scent of perfume from Karen Wickfield's designer bag, and the sharp edge of fear as phones buzzed with notifications. Margaret Harper sat in seat 2, her platinum card still clutched in her hand like a lifeline, but the calm she'd fought to maintain was fraying at the edges. Outside, The viral video of her confrontation had exploded, hitting 2 million views before the plane even left the gate. Hashtags like Skylux discrimination, trending nationally, drawing eyes from newsrooms to living rooms across the country. This wasn't just about one-seat Anna Marie, it was a national scandal, and Margaret was at its heart. The discovery that changed everything came in a flicker on a passenger's phone screen. The businesswoman across the aisle, her laptop now closed, had been recording since Trevor's first condescending remark. Now, her device pinged with alert shares, likes, retweets. The video was out there, raw and unfiltered, showing Jessica's tight smile, Trevor's sneer, Karen's bribe, and Margaret's quiet dignity as she stood her ground. Within minutes, major news outlets picked it up, and celebrities began amplifying the story to their millions of followers. The cabin, once a bubble of luxury, now felt like a fishbowl, every move watched, every word judged. Margaret felt a surge of both dread and hope, a roller coaster of emotions that made her stomach churn. She turned to Tom Sullivan, her childhood friend and retired lawyer, who stood beside her, his face a mask of guilt and determination. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked, her voice low but sharp, cutting through the hum of the cabin. "You worked with Skylux years ago, helped them with contracts. Did you know they had policies like this?" Tom's face paled, his eyes avoiding hers, the lines around his mouth deepening. "Maggie, I didn't think it was this bad," he admitted, his voice breaking, a crack in the armor he'd worn for decades. "I helped them with legal stuff, but I never saw the front line. I should have spoken up, but I didn't. I am sorry." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left her breathless. Her oldest friend, the one she trusted most, had been complicit in the system that was now trying to humiliate her. She stared at him, her mind racing back to South Chicago, to late nights coding together, to promises they'd made as kids to change the world. Now, those promises felt like ashes. But before she could respond, the glass doors at the gate burst open, and Clara Jenkins, her 35-year-old granddaughter, stormed in, her face flushed with anger, her phone glowing with the same video that was breaking the internet. "Grandma, I saw it online. What the heck is happening?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and fury, her eyes wide and wet. Margaret's heart sank, the weight of the moment pressing down, but Clara's presence was a spark, a reminder she wasn't alone. "They're trying to force me out of my seat because I'm not who they want here," Margaret explained, her voice steady despite the storm inside, her hands tightening around her tablet. Clara's eyes narrowed, her jaw set. "This isn't just about you, Grandma. This is about every person they've ever treated like this, every black traveler, every outsider. We're not letting them win." Together, they stood, a team forged in the fire of injustice. But the burden of the past and the present loomed large. Sheriff Daniel Reed, the airport security chief, stepped in now, his expression grim as he pushed through the crowd at the gate. He had reviewed the passenger's video, his radio crackling with updates from his team, and knew this wasn't just a seating dispute, it was a powder keg. "Ma'am, I'm sorry you're going through this," he said to Margaret, his voice sincere, his uniform crisp but his eyes tired. "We're investigating, but this is bigger than me. The airline's in deep trouble." He showed her his tablet, the video looping endlessly, each view adding fuel to the fire, each comment a shout of outrage or support. Inside Margaret, the turmoil was deafening. She faced her deepest funnet, just losing her dignity in this moment, but failing the promise she made at her father's grave all those years ago in South Chicago, under that gray sky, to make people see each other as human beings first. She closed her eyes, the hum of the terminal fading, and took a deep breath, the scent of jet fuel and coffee grounding her. When she opened them, she knew what she had to do. "We're not running," she told Clara and Tom, her voice firm, a quiet strength rising from the ashes of betrayal. "We're going to expose this and fix it, no matter what it costs." The turning point came when Tom confessed more, his voice shaking as he leaned closer, the weight of decades pressing down. "Maggie, there's something else," he said, his eyes finally meeting hers. "I own a small stake in Skylux, about 5%. I stayed quiet because I thought I could change things from the inside, nudge them toward fairness. But I was wrong. You're right to fight, and I'm with you now all the way. His admission was another blow, but it also gave Margaret leverage, a tool she hadn't expected. If Tom was a shareholder, they could use his position to call an emergency meeting, to force Skylux to face the mirror. The cabin buzzed with tension as news spread like wildfire. Jessica, Trevor, and Captain Reynolds huddled to the front, their faces pale, their whispers frantic as they realized the video was out there, unstoppable. Karen, still smug in her seat, adjusted her seatbelt, oblivious to the storm coming her way, her champagne glass glinting under the cabin lights as she muttered about delays. But the real question, the one that would keep you up at night, lingered like a shadow. Could Margaret turn this humiliation into a chance to change an entire industry? Or would it all fall apart before she could strike? The storm that had started in Seat 2A of Skylux Airlines had now swept across the nation, a wildfire fueled by 5 million views of the viral video, hashtags blazing online, and a tide of outrage that threatened to drown the airline. Margaret Harper stood at the center, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. The first-class cabin behind her now a distant memory as she faced the crisis head-on. The terminal buzzed with activity passengers whispering, phones pinging, security radios crackling, but for Margaret, this was personal, professional, and explosive, a reckoning that would either break her or remake the world she'd fought to change. At Skylux headquarters, miles away in a sleek glass-walled office on the top floor, CEO Richard Williams sat surrounded by quarterly reports, his phone buzzing relentlessly like a trapped wasp. The PR director's voice crackled through an internal line, panic sharpening every word. "Sir, the situation's spiraling out of control," she said, her breath uneven. "The videos everywhere, CNN, Twitter, even celebrities are amplifying it. Our stock's down 12% in the last hour, and analysts predict it could hit 30 by closing if we don't act fast." Williams felt the blood drain from his face, his ties suddenly too tight, his office too small. He had dismissed the initial report as a routine passenger issue, something PR could smooth over with a press release. But now it was a full-blown catastrophe, a PR nightmare unfolding in real time. The twist came fast and hard, a sledgehammer to the gut. Williams watched the video again on his massive monitor. A moment Jessica pressured Margaret with that tight smile, Trevor's threatening lean, Karen's casual bribe slipping into Jessica's pocket, and Margaret's calm dignity as security escorted her off. Then came the revelation that turned his world upside down. The PR director stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, the passenger, it's Margaret Harper, founder and CEO of Right Tech Solutions, the company we've been courting for a $50 million partnership to modernize our systems. And she owns 25% of our shares." The silence that followed was deafening, the air sucked out of the room. 25% a controlling stake when combined with her strategic partners. Margaret wasn't just a victim. She was the one holding the reins, and Williams hadn't even known it. He grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed Margaret, his voice strained with forced cordiality. "Mrs. Harper, I want to extend our deepest apologies for the inexcusable incident this morning." He began, sweat beading on his forehead, but Margaret cut him off, her tone cold and resolute, a blade slicing through his platitudes. "I'm not interested in apologies, Mr. Williams. I want an emergency shareholder meeting. Now." The line went dead, and Williams stared at the phone, the weight of her words sinking in. She wasn't asking, she was commanding, and he had no choice but to obey. Back at the terminal, Margaret stood with Tom Sullivan, Clara Jenkins, and Sheriff Daniel Reed, a makeshift war council in the chaos of the airport. The security chief had gathered witness statements and the passenger's video, his tablet glowing with evidence, but his hands were tied by jurisdiction. "This is airline territory," he said, his face grim, his uniform crisp against the backdrop of hurried travelers. "But I'll back you up, ma'am. What they did was wrong, and the evidence is clear as day." Margaret nodded, her mind racing. the scent of jet fuel and coffee grounding her as she processed the betrayal and the opportunity. The darkest moment hit like a tidal wave, threatening to pull her under. Online, some of Skylux's smaller shareholders began questioning her motives, their comments flooding social media like a venomous tide. Is she just playing the victim to get attention? One tweet read, racking up thousands of likes. Maybe she shouldn't have been there in the first place. First class isn't for everyone. Another sneered, the words a dagger to Margaret's heart. The doubt crushed her, echoing every time she'd been told she didn't belong. South Chicago playgrounds, college lecture halls, corporate boardrooms. She felt isolated, even betrayed. Tom's confession about his 5% stake and years of silence still stung. A fresh wound, but she wasn't alone. Clara's fierce determination and Daniel's quiet support were anchors in the storm. This isn't about me, she told Clara, her voice breaking but resolute. It's about every person who's ever been told they don't belong. Meanwhile, Jessica, Trevor, and Captain Reynolds were summoned to a sterile conference room at Skylux headquarters. The walls bare, the air cold with fluorescent light. The HR director entered, flanked by legal counsel and 2 security officers who stood by the door, their presence a silent threat. She placed 3 identical folders on the table, her voice flat but final. Your employment with Skylux Airlines is terminated effective immediately. The statement landed like a physical blow, and Jessica's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp, her eyes wide with shock. Trevor's face flushed red, his voice rising with indignation. We were just following procedure. That passenger was being difficult, disrupting boarding. But the HR director opened her laptop, the viral video playing in high definition. Trevor's condescension, Jessica's discomfort, the captain's weak justifications, and the damning moment of Karen's bribe, her whispered standards audible despite her attempt at discretion. Jessica broke down in tears, sobbing into her hands. Captain Reynolds closed his eyes, his weathered face aging decades in seconds, and Trevor's defiance crumbled as he realized the cost of his arrogance. Back at the terminal, Margaret's plan for counterattack took shape, a phoenix rising from the ashes of humiliation. Tom, now fully committed, pulled out his phone, scrolling through legal documents he'd kept for his Skylux days. We can force a vote, he said, his voice shaking but firm. With your 25% and my 5%, we have enough to demand change firings, training, the works. Clara, tapping furiously on her laptop, dug into Skylux's public records, her eyes narrowing as she found gold. Grandma, their customer service rankings have been slipping for years, and their booking systems are a mess. They need your tech to survive. They're desperate. Let's make them pay for this with accountability. Margaret nodded, a spark of hope igniting in her chest, the weight of their words lifting her spirits. The pressure was at its peak, a tightrope stretched to breaking. Karen, still on the plane, remained oblivious, sipping champagne and muttering about her missed meeting, the glass glinting under the cabin lights as she adjusted her seatbelt. But the airline's fate hung by a thread, and Margaret knew it. She stood taller, her suit rumpled, but her resolve ironclad. The promise from her father's grave echoing in her mind toe, make people see each other as human beings first. The micro hook that would keep you gripping your seat was this. Could she pull this off, turning humiliation into power, or would the system crush her before she could strike back? The emergency shareholder meeting at Skylux Airlines headquarters was a scene of chaos and quiet power, unlike anything in its 30-year history. The boardroom buzzed with tension, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and nervous sweat as executives sat in their leather chairs, some still in golf shirts, others with ties loosened after rushing from family dinners. The massive windows offered a view of the city skyline, lights twinkling against the dusk, but all eyes were on Margaret Harper as she walked in. At 42, her presence was electric quiet, confident, unyielding, her suit rumpled from the day's ordeal, but her head high, the same woman they tried to remove from seat 2 and now holding their fate. Behind her stood Tom Sullivan, Clara Jenkins, and Sheriff Daniel Reed, their faces set with determination, a united front forged in the fire of injustice. This wasn't just about one woman, Anna Maria. It was about a reckoning that would reshape Skylux and beyond. Margaret took her seat at the head of the long table, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the pale faces and fidgeting hands. Richard Williams, the CEO, stood at the front, his suit wrinkled, his hands trembling as he activated the massive screen with a remote. The viral video played again, its images sharp and devastating. Jessica's tight smile as she told Margaret she didn't belong, Trevor's threatening lean with that condescending smirk, Karen's casual bribe slipping into Jessica's pocket, and Margaret's calm dignity as security escorted her off the plane, her back straight despite the humiliation. When the footage ended, the silence was heavy, broken only by the faint creak of a chair as a board member shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Margaret's gaze. Williams cleared his throat, his voice weak and unsteady, a man grasping at straws. "Mrs. Harper, we want to express our deepest apologies," he began, sweat beading on his forehead, his tie askew. "This behavior does not reflect Skylux's values." Margaret cut him off, her voice steady but resolute, a blade slicing through his empty words. "I'm not here for apologies, Mr. Williams. I'm here for change." The room rippled with tension, a wave of unease spreading as she continued, her words measured but unyielding. "As your largest individual shareholder with 25% of your stock, I have one demand. Every staff member involved, Jessica Miller, Trevor the supervisor, Captain James Reynolds, is terminated immediately. And I'm canceling the $50 million contract with Right Tech Solutions unless you commit to a complete cultural overhaul, starting with mandatory bias training for every employee." The board murmured, a low hum of shock and resistance, but Williams knew he was cornered. "Perhaps suspensions instead," he ventured, his voice faltering, grasping for a lifeline. "Some of these employees have been with us for years, and our union agreements." Margaret's gaze silenced him, her eyes hard with the weight of her father's promise. "No," she said, placing her hands flat on the table, her voice rising with quiet power. "Accountability, or I pull my investment and flood the market with my shares. You'll be bankrupt by morning." As if on cue, the boardroom doors burst open, a young financial analyst rushing in, breathless, his tie flapping as he thrust a tablet toward Williams. "Sir, news of the incident is tanking our stock. It's down 12% and falling fast. Analysts predict a 30% drop by closing if we don't act now." The decision was made in that moment, the room tilting under the weight of reality. Jessica, Trevor, and Captain Reynolds were fired that afternoon, summoned to a sterile conference room where the HR director delivered the news with cold finality. Security escorting them out as their faces crumpled, Jessica sobbing, Trevor pale, Reynolds aged beyond his years. Karen Wickfield faced a lifetime ban from Skylux, her name plastered across social media as Airline Karen. Her smug satisfaction replaced by a stunned silence as her world unraveled. But Margaret's vision stretched beyond punishment. The micro twist came when Tom stood up, his voice trembling as he faced the room, his gray suit wrinkled, but his resolve firm. "I have to confess something," he said, his eyes locking with Margaret's, a flicker of shame in them. "I own 5% of Skylux shares. I stayed silent for years, thinking I could change things from the inside, nudge them toward fairness. I was wrong, Maggie, and I'm sorry." The room gasped, a collective intake of breath, but Margaret nodded, her expression softening for the first time that day. "Then let's fix it together," she said, her voice warm but unwavering, a moment of redemption for Tom that shifted the dynamic. Her oldest friend wasn't just a bystander. He was part of the solution now, his guilt a bridge to action. The final confrontation unfolded as Skylux announced a company-wide shutdown for 48 hours, a move that sent shockwaves through the industry. Every flight, every route, every service halted while all employees underwent mandatory bias training developed by Right Tech Solutions, the cost staggering millions in lost revenue, but the message unmistakable. Change was non-negotiable. Margaret addressed the gathered employees in the main auditorium, her voice carrying the weight of her journey, the hum of the crowd fading as she spoke. "This isn't just about punishing those involved," she said, her suit still rumpled, but her presence towering. "It's about transforming your culture. What happened to me happens to people without my resources, everyday Black travelers, outsiders, the overlooked. Today we start changing that, not with words, but with action." In the weeks that followed, Skylux implemented sweeping changes, new policies banning discrimination, enhanced seating protocols to prevent favoritism, protections for whistleblowers who reported misconduct. Conference rooms became training centers, flight schedules shifted, and every employee, from baggage handlers to Williams himself, faced their biases through immersive simulations crafted by Margaret's team. Passengers noticed the difference almost immediately, their voices captured at gates and baggage claims. The flight attendants seemed more attentive now. A frequent flyer in a worn jacket noted, his suitcase at his side. Before, it felt like there was an invisible hierarchy based on how you looked. White folks got the smiles. Everyone else got the shrugs. 6 months later, Skylux was thriving, passenger numbers up 12%, employee satisfaction at an all-time high, the toxic culture exposed and healing. Margaret launched the Second Chance program through her foundation, offering training and jobs to those who'd lost everything due to bias. Jessica, Trevor, and Captain Reynolds among the first, their journeys hard but redemptive as they confronted their actions and rebuilt. Margaret stood taller, her promise from South Chicago fulfilled, knowing justice wasn't just punishment, it was progress, a legacy for her father's memory. The story circled back to that morning at the gate, when Jessica had said, "This seat isn't for you," a phrase that had echoed through Margaret's life. Now it was a rallying cry turned on its head, a testament to resilience. The lingering question for you, the one that settles deep: would you have the courage to fight back against injustice, or would you let it win, silent and unseen? Folks, thank you so much for sticking with this story to the end. It's been a journey, hasn't it? If you stood with Margaret, hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and drop a comment below. What would you do in her shoes? Check out our next video for more stories that hit hard and lift you up. We'll see you soon. Take care and keep fighting the good fight.